that our guest speaker, Peter HAYS, may be guided and inspired this evening to share the message of the gospel that's one of love and deepening understanding. We pray for all of those that are present here today in both realms of life. May each one of us empty our cups and be fully present here in this moment for this evening, so we may absorb and take in all the lesson and the teachings that we may experience. We pray with much gratitude in our hearts for this opportunity to be here together and experience these blessings. We thank you, and so be it. Are we going to get the light? No? Okay. All right. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, and hello, Peter. I'm going to introduce you before I give you the floor. Once again, Peter, thank you so much for being here. And for those of you who are not familiar, I'm going to give you a brief background on who Mr. Peter HAYS is. He's well known to us. Peter HAYS is a worker at the Spiritist group Love and Light in Newark, New Jersey. He is also the current outreach director of the United States Spiritist Federation and an active participant in the Tri-State Spiritist Federation. He has done several talks on Spiritism, includes participation in the United States Spiritist Symposiums, besides doing over 60 episodes of the radio program Living Spring on Kardec Radio. He was also the editing staff for the Spirits book by the USSF, or United States Spiritist Federation. Peter loves playing guitar, so he teaches the youth at Love and Light. Peter has published several children's books with his wife, Betty Rosen, through their company, Sem Fronteiras Press, and with other publishers in Brazil, Colombia, and the U.S. Peter, we are so happy to have you with us here today. It is a pleasure to have you here with us. And today, Peter's going to be talking about the topic, the law of progress in America. Dan, are you able to? Okay. And Peter will come back for the Q&A. Can't hear you.
Okay.
Okay, good. We got you.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Spiritist Society of Baltimore. It is a pleasure to be here. The third part of the Spirits book focuses on the divine laws, the laws that come from God. And in chapter 8, it focuses on the law of progress. There are two questions in the law of progress that I happen to find very fascinating and very captivating. They have to do with the nature of nations and also civilizations. Question 788 is asking the question about the quality of a nation. It reads, nations are collective individualities that pass through the phases of infancy, maturity, and decline, just as individuals do. Does this truth, as proven by history, imply that the most advanced nations of this country will ultimately experience their decline and end, just like those of antiquity? So the question is asking, look at the modern nations that we have. Are they going to die out the way human beings do? The answer to that is more, it depends. Because the answer says nations that only live a material life and whose greatness is based on force and territorial expansion are born, grow, and die. Because the strength of a nation eventually becomes exhausted, like that of an individual. Nations whose centers, whose selfish laws are opposed to the progress of enlightenment and charity die, because light kills darkness and charity kills selfishness. That being said, nations and individuals also have a spiritual life, and those whose laws are in harmony with God's eternal laws will continue to live and serve as a beacon for other nations. So countries that are all about conquest, domination. In the 20th century, we had a number of examples of countries that were really driven by ideology. A lot of times when there's that kind of mindset involved, then the chances that a country is going to last will be limited because it will exhaust its own strength. So the key phrase in this answer is that nations whose selfish laws are opposed to the progress of enlightenment and charity, and the idea that light kills darkness and charity kills selfishness. Now, question 793 is a shorter question, and it simply asks, what are the signs of a fully developed nation? This is a longer answer, but it says some interesting things. You recognize it, a civilization, by its moral development. You think you are advanced because you have made great discoveries and brilliant inventions, and because you are better sheltered and clothed than savages. However, you will only truly have the right to call yourself civilized when you have eradicated vices from your society and when you live as brothers and sisters, practicing Christian charity. Until then, you are merely enlightened nations that have only passed through the first phase of civilization. It goes on to say, civilization has its degrees, like everything else. A civilization in transition is an incomplete civilization. It produces distinct evils unknown in the primitive state. Still, it constitutes a natural and necessary progress that remedies the problems it causes. As civilization is perfected, it ends some of the problems it causes, and these troubles vanish completely with moral progress. This part of the answer is very interesting because what it's basically saying is that as a country develops, as it starts to develop technology, for instance, it starts creating new problems that weren't there before. And part of the challenge is to try to resolve those problems. But at the end of the day, the real solution has to do with moral progress. Now, before we continue with this long answer, I'm going to take a moment and simply ask the question, what do we mean exactly when we say the word civilization? Well, here's the definition. Civilization is an advanced state of intellectual, cultural, and material development in human society, marked by progress in the arts and sciences, the extensive use of record keeping, including writing, and the appearance of complex political and social institutions. So what about the United States of America? Are we an advanced state of intellectual, cultural, and material development in human society? Yes, in many ways we are. Are we marked by progress in the arts and sciences? Yes. Is it ideal? Not necessarily. But what's interesting in this observation about civilization is both the arts and the sciences matter. It was said by Picasso, art is the lie that tells the truth. So art is a way of personal exploration, and sciences, of course, are about inquiry and progress. We certainly have both. And then the extensive use of record keeping, obviously we have that. And this country certainly has complex political and social institutions. So we are certainly a civilization. How advanced we are, well, I'm going to spend some time trying to reflect on that. But before we get there, here's some questions that one could ask. I'm going to continue first. The most advanced nation from any two that have reached the top of the social ladder is the one with the least amount of selfishness, pride, greed, and pride. The one whose habits are morally better, more intellectual than material, and where intelligence can develop freely. It is the one with the greatest amount of goodness, good faith, compassion, and generosity. It is where prejudices of class and birth are not rooted because they are incompatible with true love of one's neighbor. Its laws do not allow privileges and are the same for every member of its society. It's where human life, beliefs, opinions are respected, and where is the smallest number of poor and unhappy individuals. Finally, it is a nation where people who are willing to work are guaranteed the essentials for survival. Now, I'm going to ask a few questions about this country based upon some of the comments of the questions I just read. Is the United States reasonably free of, quote, selfishness, greed, and pride? What about this one? How much do we just live a material life and focus on territorial expansion? Does the U.S.A., the United States of America, have a collective spiritual life? If so, what is it? What do we mean by that? How much does this country practice Christian charity, or for that matter, any charity? How do we characterize what charity is? And how much does that get practiced in this country? And another question, have we truly accepted equality because we know that prejudices of class and birth are not rooted because they are incompatible with true love for one's neighbors? How does the United States measure up to that? Well, I'll return to these questions in a little bit. But I want to mention a few things about this presentation. This presentation is the kind that's looking at this country in a broad perspective. It is impossible to try to cover everything one might possibly think of when it comes to a country as diverse and complex as this one. So, and especially trying to do this in an hour. I mean, this could take a week or more, easily. So I'm going to ask some questions. I won't necessarily answer all of them definitively, but I want to encourage some thinking about how this country compares to some of the observations made in question 788, and especially in question 793, which talks about the qualities of an advanced civilization. How are we doing? Well, let's look at a few things. There have been a number of profound changes. The United States is now almost 240 years old. I'm basing that on the year we won our independence from Great Britain, 1783. I am not necessarily going to include the history, the long history before that led to the formation of this country, when it was the 13 colonies and well before that. That too is part of this country's identity. But for the purposes of what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to focus more on the short period of time. I mean, 240 years is not that long. Rome lasted about 1,000 years. That is based on the way you understand the ways in which Rome continued long after the zenith of its power. Because people say, well, it ended around the 500th or 5th century, more or less, 4th century, 5th century, but it actually continued beyond that in various ways, but it wasn't quite the same. Well, in this country, and really the world at large, if we just go back 240 years, there have been some very profound changes, to say the least. For instance, the Industrial Revolution transformed the world, and the United States played a significant role in that. This was really starting by around the 1820s, 1830s or so, and going forward from there. The Industrial Revolution gave us a number of tools for our progress that were significant, and it transformed the way we view the world. It transformed the way we interact with one another. It certainly created a lot of challenges. Remember that point earlier in question 793 about how as nations develop, as civilizations develop, new problems can get created. Well, that certainly has occurred. There have been significant advances in science in all sorts of ways, and the United States has played a very sizable role in all of that. There have been colossal advances. When we talk about the codification of Spiritism, which began in the 1850s and into the 1860s, well, the world then versus the world now is just night and day. There's far more that we understand and far more we've yet to learn. But there have been significant advances of science, and that has certainly had a profound impact on this country. There have been significant improvements in technology. It's been argued that as technology improves, it has a positive effect on democracy. Why? Because it allows for greater freedom of information. Information flows more freely. We certainly can observe that now, in which we live in a world where information, an event happens, and seconds later people know about it. That has had a significant impact on modern life, because it used to be, back in, say, the time of our founding fathers in the 1780s and 90s, that it could take weeks to find out when something happened. So the rate of information is much, much faster. And again, this has had a positive effect on democracy. What about other areas? The rights of women, the rights of people of color. What about the rights of sexual orientation? Well, this country certainly has seen significant changes in all of these. We have a long ways to go, but the access to power that women have today, and people of color as well, is unprecedented. And it wasn't that long ago when there were very significant and very rigid barriers in place that would made this unlikely. But it is more and more possible, and that too is transforming the way we look at the world, the way we look at ourselves, and the way we look at one another. As far as sexual orientation is concerned, that is changing. I would say in some ways this is kind of one of the civil rights issues of modern life now. I remember someone who was gay years ago who was very angry that he felt like he couldn't be himself in public. He couldn't hold his partner's hand and things like that. Well, this is something that is more, you've seen more of that happening now. It's not fully accepted, of course, but there is a move in this direction, which has a lot to do with tolerance, compassion, acceptance for other people. So things are moving in this direction, and this country has certainly played a role in that. It's been very mixed, obviously, in all of these areas, but there's nevertheless, if you look at the way things are now versus 100 years ago, 200 years ago, very significant differences. Our relationship to warfare. Well, this one's a little dubious because World War I was essentially a 19th century style war fought with 20th century weapons. And that's one of the reasons why so many casualties occurred. And then technology began to transform the way warfare was conducted. And in World War II, there was still high casualty rates. But what happened was, as I'm sure many of you are very familiar with, we ended the war with the atomic bomb and the nuclear age. Now, is that progress? Well, not really, but what I'm getting at is the following. It became understood that if we're going to continue in warfare, we really have to think twice about it. And so far, at least, that has affected the way in which people look at war and approach war. We can't go too far because the capacity for massive destruction is enormous. So this is a huge test. It is a dubious test. It's dangerous in many ways, but at the same time, it's also an example of how technology has, in some ways, put limits on our willingness to commit war. You remember before in the question 788 that talks about a nation being characterized by territorial expansion. Well, it used to be that wars and invasions were commonplace. Nowadays, it's considered rare and surprising when a nation invades another. There's more tolerance of religious backgrounds in this country. I'm going to say more about this in a moment, about how this country was set up to allow for that, but that doesn't mean it worked in practice. There was a lot of religious bigotry up until more recently. There still is, but for example, but things are more, generally speaking, more tolerant in many ways than there used to be. For example, John F. Kennedy, when he was elected president in 1960, that was a pretty big deal because John F. Kennedy was a Catholic. It was the first time any politician who was Catholic had a chance at the presidency. The assumption was, well, he's going to be loyal to the Pope, not to the nation. This was a kind of prejudice that was occurring in this country. But when Kennedy became elected, that prejudice began to dissolve more and more. But it used to be that if you weren't Protestant Christian, you didn't stand a chance as a politician. So those kinds of artificial, bigoted, prejudiced barriers were starting to dissolve. There's more intellectual freedom today than there was before. Why do I say that? Well, again, I'll say more about this as we move forward, but in the beginning, there was freedom of the press, freedom of information, and we live in a time in which people are free to pursue any intellectual interests they want, providing they're not breaking the law, of course, but nevertheless, people can pursue various beliefs. Well, that wasn't always the case. It used to be that one's religious beliefs, if they were open about them, could get one in a lot of trouble, or political beliefs for that matter. It's not 100% by any means, but this country has many of the best universities in the world, and colleges, universities are all about academic exploration. So in many ways, there's more intellectual freedom than ever before. People are more willing to hear and interact with ideas that maybe they've not encountered before. You've seen a lot of changes about that in just the last few decades. That said, it doesn't always mean that when we have this free will at our disposal, that we engage in thoughtful discourse or thoughtful pursuits. Many people use their free will to enjoy banality, frankly. Now, this country has certainly had its challenges. Here are just a few, and there are others that one could think of. The growing inequality in rich and poor. In just the last 40 years, starting in the early 1980s, one of the things that happened was antitrust laws were weakened. So it allowed companies to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And wealth began to concentrate. Now, in a way, this is nothing terribly new because there was wealth concentration in various ways going on long before. But we live in a time in which the gap between the rich and poor is significant. And this does cause a lot of social problems. In a more extreme example, sometimes when there's a lot of inequality, one way to keep a system like that in place is repression. So there are fears about the consequences of this. There also are people who are feeling more and more demoralized as a result. Along these same lines, it's one of the reasons why some people may be losing faith or are losing faith in our institutions to address various economic, social problems. Some people, especially those who believe in the American dream, feel like the American dream is dead. Well, that depends on how we define the American dream. If the American dream is about social success, material success, getting ahead, and so forth, that can be a recipe for disappointment. But I'm going to say more about what the American dream really means as we move forward. But there is a sense that because of the structure of power right now, growing inequality between rich and poor, the influence that, say, corporations have over society is one example. There is a perception sometimes that our institutions are beholden to the most powerful and not to everyone else. One of the things this country struggles with is its social safety net compared to other countries that are as developed as ours. And that's not necessarily just a political comment. Institutions like the Brookings Institutions, which is one of America's best think tanks, as it were, does all kinds of research and depends on how you view it. But many viewed it as being centrist. Some see it as slightly more liberal. Some see it as slightly more conservative. But the Brookings Institution is an organization that many cite as an example as a reliable source of information, and they do attempt to do careful research. I mention this because there is a perception that, there is the comment that the social safety net in this country compared to other developed nations is at times lacking. It's uneven, certainly. Some lack respect for one another and for the rule of law. Again, this is a bit of a generalization and one has to be careful, but sometimes there is a feeling of people who feel entitled, people who feel that the rules that apply to everyone else don't really apply to me. And sometimes it's been commented that these days the level of rudeness seems to have gone up. And maybe there are some in a variety of backgrounds who feel like they can break the laws a little bit. They can kind of do more or less what they feel like. There seems to be among some people a kind of indifference to consequence, something that's very important in Spiritism, of course. And along these lines, there are times when there seems to be more examples or increase of sociopathic behavior or psychopathic behavior, psychopathic meaning people who are truly indifferent to consequences. There are, of course, serious environmental issues, and the United States has played a role in creating some of these. Most of the world's scientists are pretty united in saying that global warming is real, for instance. And I don't want to spend a lot of time commenting on this, but if that is indeed true, then we are in a time where there are solutions being put forward. There's direction being made to try to alleviate some of these problems. But it's an example of where, as a nation develops, it creates problems that didn't exist when it was in the primitive state. That comment in question 788. Well, this is certainly an example of that, where we have these, we're seeing more and more signs of it, and many scientists feel it's very real. And yet there is a lot of struggle about this. There's a lack of political will. There are some very real logistical difficulties in transforming the society. But it doesn't mean that it can't be solved. But it's something that's going to require a great deal of effort. Now, as far as the challenges that are both the changes that have occurred in this country and the challenges that we're facing, are we able to resolve these things? Is America at the point where that's it, we're not going to change anymore? We're pretty much entrenched as we are, and that's it. Well, let's take a look at our beginning and go over a few things. In 1776, as I'm sure most of you are aware, that was the year we declared our independence. The Declaration of Independence, which was mostly written by Thomas Jefferson, is a document that was very inspired by the Age of Enlightenment. And one of the things it stresses is that all people are created equal, and this is not only a right, but it's part of natural law, if you will. It's a given that all people are created equal. Now, I'm quite aware of the fact that it says in the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. That's a reflection of the time in which this document was written. And notice in this picture, it's all white men. But the architecture of the beginnings of this country were we're trying to address the possibility of getting to that point where all people have equal access, even if they were far from it at the time. The Declaration of Independence was a big and open challenge to divine right monarchy, which is how much of the world operated up until around this time, up until the Age of Enlightenment in the 1700s. The idea of a divine right monarchy, of course, is that kings and queens were the ones that had absolute power. Wherever you were born, you were going to stay there, and that was pretty much it, put very simply. And the Age of Enlightenment was challenging all of that. And so the Declaration of Independence was a challenge to the power of Great Britain. Thomas Paine, the British journalist who was in favor of American independence, the independence of the colonies, who was very critical of the monarchy, argued that not only is it immoral and wrong and won't last, but there's absolutely no way Britain can control the expansion of the 13 colonies because the land is so huge, and it was only a matter of time. So the Declaration of Independence was declared in 1776, and we won our independence by 1793. And then by 1789, the Constitution of the United States was created. Now, the Constitution of the United States was essential. The country didn't function properly when this country first won its independence from Great Britain. There were a lot of structural difficulties and logistical problems that the country was not equipped to deal with. And the fact that we have a constitution at all is something of a miracle, because our founding fathers profoundly disagreed with each other. It took 2 years to get the Constitution into the beginning stages that it was. And it is an amazing example of people coming together despite the fact that they disagreed profoundly, at times didn't trust each other. And some of the difficulties back then are difficulties we're living with today. For example, states' rights versus the federal government and those kinds of issues, which one hears about today. Well, a lot of that kind of issue was going on back at this time. But in spite of the challenges, despite of the fact that it's a miracle the Constitution came together at all, there was enough of an ability, the founding fathers were able to try to create a structure of government, which was truly unique. Now, there is a wonderful book that I'd like to share with you all called The American Soul by Jacob Nielman, professor at San Francisco State University, has a religious background, but is also a background in philosophy. And he spent time talking about what America's identity is about. And he focuses on the origins of this country, the time period I've been focusing on just now. And here's some comments that he makes that I think are important to think about. He says, to be an American was an idea, not an escapable organic given. America is a nation formed by philosophical ideas that have been thought through by human beings. It is the only nation in the world that is so constituted. America is not a tribal, ethnic, or racial identity. It is a philosophical identity composed of ideas of freedom, liberty, independent thought, independent conscience, self-reliance, hard work, justice. Look at this. We are founded on a philosophical identity. We're not based upon a particular religious background or ethnic background, and so forth. And so America was unique that way. He goes on to say that this philosophical identity is both the weakness and the strength of America. That is, to love America is not to love one's roots, it is to love the flower that is not yet blossomed, the fruit as yet unripened. To love America is to love the future. And perhaps it is this that sets the love of America apart from what men and women of other nations feel about their native land. So sometimes one might feel like Americans are a little rootless because we're founded on a philosophical idea, certain ideas about liberty, freedom, independent thought. Are we all clear about that? Are we all clear on what that really means? Are we clear about the implications of it? Well, that's a little dubious. But the other important point here is that part of loving this country, as it were, is to realize that part of being connected to this country is to embrace the future, to realize that the way things are now are not the last and final word. So when we talk about the progress of America, we are looking forward. Americans are ideally, I'm talking about the ideals of America, is that we are definitely planting seeds today that will affect the outcome tomorrow. Is that important in Spiritism? Absolutely. It's one of the things Spiritism stresses over and over again. Jesus stresses this about planting seeds. There's so much agricultural imagery in the Gospels that talk about the seed, the potential of the soul, and so forth. So this country was structured in such a way that it was allowing us to look forward. It wasn't divine right monarchy where wherever you're born, that's where you wind up, end of story. And people were stuck in their class systems. And God forbid they express certain ideas openly, because there was a very good chance they would suffer severe consequences if they did. So the way this country was structured was different. It allows for progress to occur. In other words, but there's another important point here. What do we mean by liberty? Nielman emphasizes, and I'll say more about this, genuine liberty is not merely an external pursuit via material success. People understand that part of liberty. You know, you try to get ahead, you try to get a better job. Maybe you're running your own business if you can, trying to get by our social class and so forth. And yet, and one of the reasons people feel frustrated now is because they feel like that's not available to everybody anymore. You know, that in some ways society is kind of a rigged game, and it's not so easy to really achieve more economic success. There are forces at work that are keeping me down, as it were, if we buy into that. Well, okay, so people in this country, I think, understand material success. Sometimes you hear Spiritists, for instance, say America's very material and stuff like that. Well, in many ways it is. But personal liberty is also an inward journey towards spiritual enlightenment. That is also what the American dream is about. And this is something that people lose sight of. The American dream is, again, if we're looking towards the future, is that only about material progress, economic progress, or is it also about spiritual progress? I'm going to focus on another section from this book, which has to do with the relationship between Thomas Jefferson, and Alexander Hamilton. They had a very acrimonious relationship, to put it mildly. There are a lot of reasons for this. Thomas Jefferson basically believed that society should be rooted in agriculture. And Thomas Jefferson thought that the introduction of money and having society being driven more by money was going to be the kiss of death, as it were. And this is a simple generalization. Alexander Hamilton, another great founding father, helped create our banking system. Alexander Hamilton felt that we needed to set up a more modern economy. And he really pushed to get a banking system in place. Jefferson was horrified by this idea. So over the years, Jefferson and Hamilton had a lot of falling out with each other. There was a lot of disagreement, they were rivals, put it simply. And one of the ways in which they were rivals was over the subject of the Bill of Rights. The Constitution, the United States Constitution, took 2 years to finally get created, and it was a very arduous process, as I mentioned before. Well, by the time it was created, Jefferson said, we need a Bill of Rights. We need an absolute, spelled out guarantee that we have freedom of the press, freedom of thought, freedom of religion, free speech, that people can assemble in protest and not get arrested, or, you know, in other words, he wanted more open, blatant guarantees that people in power will not abuse those they are ruling. But also the Constitution was set up to make sure that people who are being ruled don't behave in ways that are inclined to move towards chaos. I'll say more in a moment about that. So Thomas Jefferson wanted the Bill of Rights, and the Bill of Rights was intended to spell things out a little bit more. Hamilton didn't think we needed a Bill of Rights. Hamilton argued that the Constitution already implies all of the guarantees in the Bill of Rights. Jefferson and Hamilton both agreed that we needed to have protections against the tyranny of power. That was what large part of what the Declaration of Independence was about. But Hamilton thought that the Bill of Rights was unnecessary. There's an interesting commentary again from the book, The American Soul, and this is going to take a little reading to do, so bear with me. But I think it's very important, because when he talks about what it means to have the rights of man, what are the natural rights of human beings, Nielman says that the point is that the idea of the rights of man, which emerged so powerfully from the Enlightenment and through the mind of Jefferson, among others, is not simply and solely a negative concept. Human rights for Jefferson does not mean solely the right not to be interfered with by government. This is only part of it, and of course, this is the part that commands so much world attention. In other words, you know, the founding fathers were trying to make sure we had a way of life that guaranteed our freedoms. And people certainly think about that now. I don't want the government encroaching on my life all the time and things like that. But Nielman is emphasizing where Jefferson was coming from, that there was more to it than that. He says, but the other part is perhaps even more important. Human rights means the right to pursue one's authentic obligations as a God-created and potentially godlike human being through the latent power of divine reason or conscience within oneself. Very interesting comment if Jefferson felt this way, because Jefferson was a little critical of religion at times, especially the dogma of religion. He goes on to say the founding of America thus reads out as the attempt to create a form of government within which human society can function as a morally and spiritually educative force. When Hamilton argues that no Bill of Rights is necessary, it is because he is attending solely to the political, legal, and economic aspects of the structure of government. He is saying that the Constitution, as drafted in Philadelphia, contains all the safeguards that are necessary to protect individuals from external oppression and tyranny. He is not concerning himself with the negative aspect of a free, of a free society. Hamilton is not concerned with the inner life. That perhaps was part of Hamilton's strength. It is around this external aspect of government that his genius is concentrated. And it is from the point of view that we may today understand his conflict with Jefferson. I'm going to read more in a moment, but I want to make the following point. It's important to keep in mind here, Hamilton was not the bad guy because he believed that money was important. Hamilton was creating a structure that would lead to a more modern economy. Jefferson wanted to keep us back in the time of agriculture. Now, Jefferson would realize later in life that Hamilton had essentially won the argument. And Jefferson, despite his brilliance, and he was a brilliant man, yes, he had flaws, but he was certainly a brilliant man, and he believed in intellectual pursuits. Jefferson was a little out of touch because he felt that the only way society should really work is based on agriculture. But Hamilton was putting in structure a economic system, or the beginnings of one, via the way money is handled, that would allow for the Industrial Revolution to occur. And it's important to keep in mind that this is an important tool. The Industrial Revolution, besides being inevitable, is not a bad thing. It's a big tool. Spiritism talks about the way money itself is not bad. Money is a tool. Money is neutral. Money is energy. It is not the root of evil. It's what we do with it that may be put to good use, or it may not be put to good use. It may intensify selfishness. And that's another subject for another time. But again, it's important to keep in mind here that neither Hamilton nor Jefferson are totally wrong in their points of view. But Jefferson's main aim is much more complex, much more mixed than Hamilton's. His aim involves a more difficult mixture of outer and inner considerations dealing with both external liberty and inward moral development. He is insisting on a Bill of Rights, not only because he fears external political oppression. In this, he was one with Hamilton. Again, both men agreed we got to watch out for people abusing their power once they have it. But where Jefferson differs from Hamilton is in his view of human possibility. Both Jefferson and Hamilton, like many of the founding fathers, clearly saw the dark side of human nature, and both sought a form of government that would keep this aspect under control, both for those ruled and those in power, through a mechanism of force and counter-force resembling the way nature itself worked. Isn't this a fascinating observation? This implies that Jefferson and Hamilton, through their divisions of opinion, and there were others that agreed with Jefferson, others who agreed with Hamilton, but Jefferson was pushing for a society that was more in harmony with nature. Could we say it's a little bit more in harmony with God's law, natural law, the law of progress? The idea that we should be free to develop ourselves inwardly without fearing the consequences that might have occurred. Let's not forget, periods like the medieval period where Galileo said the earth is not flat, and that got him into a lot of trouble. He got into a lot of trouble with the church. So, we take for granted this idea that we can express our opinions and our ideas and our beliefs, but this was not always the case. And when we have that freedom, then we can really begin to work on develop our spiritual progress. So the architecture of the United States is set up to allow this possibility. Nielman goes on to say that, but unlike Hamilton, Jefferson also passionately believed in the perfectibility of human nature, the capacity of individual human beings to grow inwardly under specific conditions of communal life and individual effort. Isn't that what Spiritists believe? Spiritists believe that we are here to work on our spiritual progress, but also Spiritism emphasizes that the material world and the material needs that we go through are not bad. We just need to avoid to worship them. We need to avoid being trapped or entrapped by materialism. If we use materialism to define who we are and whether or not we're worthwhile to begin with, we're going to get into a lot of trouble. So again, Jefferson was pushing for, we have these freedoms, let's use them and let's make good use of them. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen nowadays. I'm going to wrap up with these points. Specifically, these conditions for Jefferson comprise a life that combines: 1, development of the mind through free intellectual discourse and free access to knowledge contained in books and gained through untrammeled scientific experiment. So Jefferson believed in, again, freedom to pursue and develop our intelligence and so forth. 2, development of the feelings through the struggle to allow one's neighbor the right to his opinion and his place in the social order. I'll say more about that later. And 3, development of the physical, organic substrate of human nature through a life in direct contact with the earth and its rhythms, its demands, its bounty, and its severity, namely a life rooted in agriculture. Okay, again, Jefferson was emphasizing agriculture in a way that kind of ignored where this country was going to go and where much of the world was going to go, of course, i.e. the Industrial Revolution. But at the time Jefferson was pushing for these things, that was not obvious yet. Well, in some ways there were signs of it, but Jefferson didn't necessarily embrace all that. But again, there is an opportunity in the way in which the Bill of Rights, the Constitution is put together. Now, the Bill of Rights has been added onto since the original document. And a lot of it is designed mainly to protect us from the tyranny of power. But if you look at it more carefully, the implication, again, is if we don't have to worry about expressing our political beliefs or our religious beliefs, then we're free to develop. We don't have to live in fear. And so, again, this country was set up to encourage this. And it's what Spiritism encourages, that we should be willing to explore all kinds of intellectual, scientific, religious subjects. Again, Spiritism is religion, philosophy, and a science. So we're encouraged to explore all of that fully and much more, and try to find some kind of balance between them, because all these branches of inquiry about the nature of our existence matter. Okay, so I'm going to go back to some of these questions. Is this country reasonably free of selfishness, greed, and pride? We're somewhere in the middle, I would say. Are there signs of selfishness, greed, and pride? Yes, to the extent that we pursue the material life and act as though the spiritual life is not so important. But it's not fair to say that Americans aren't spiritual and that values and moral values don't matter. They matter a great deal for many people. There can be disagreement about what those values are, but certainly both are, there are times when people in this country can be selfish and greedy and very prideful, but there are times when people in this country can be very generous, very open-minded, and so forth. What about how much do we just live a material life and focus on territorial expansion? Again, a comment from question 788 about the nature of nations. Are we merely a nation about conquest? Well, I don't have time to get into this in great detail, but certainly since the time this country became a world power, after World War II especially, but even before, we did interfere in the internal affairs of other countries, sometimes overtly and sometimes covertly. And this has certainly occurred. It's been a part of this country's history. We have certainly done some things that were rather unjust at times, but that's not all. We have also helped countries a great deal. We have tried at times to treat other countries fairly and decently. One of the big lessons in World War II, as a result of World War I, Germany was punished in World War I rather severely for starting the war. That led to many of the tensions that created World War II. But things were handled differently from World War II onward. There was an effort to be more just in the way countries were handled. Germany was not punished in the same way. Japan, well, yes, the atomic bombs were very bad, and cause severe harm. But there was also an effort to help countries like Japan rebuild. I'm not saying that was a perfect process, but it's not like this country just dominates other nations and then annihilates them or anything like that. So that would be unfair. So again, it's a mix, but we are both making the effort. And I think nowadays there is more of an effort to think a little bit more about the way in which we have an influence around the world. Does America have a collective spiritual life? Well, America is a very religious country in many ways, and we have a variety of religions. Christianity is certainly very important here. Protestant Christianity historically was a little more dominant, but it's open to a large variety of religions. There are many, many branches of Christianity, to put it mildly, but also Eastern religions, Judaism, Muslim faith, and so forth, all of these. And again, it's important to remember that the Constitution and the Bill of Rights guaranteed that you could have religious freedom. So that was an important part of this country. So that doesn't always mean, and some people follow traditional mainstream religions, and others would prefer to describe themselves as being spiritual. They want to avoid those constructs. But people are not persecuted for having those beliefs as well. They may get some upset, but that doesn't mean they can't have those beliefs. So, we're in a state of process about this, but at least there is the intent to allow for religious freedom. How much does this country practice Christian charity or any charity? Well, again, are we in agreement about what charity really means? In many ways, Americans are very generous. Not all are Christians, of course. And so this answer was psychographed via the Spirit's book in 1857 in the country of France, which was a Catholic country. So one might make some allowances for that. Was it necessarily aimed at a country like this one? Well, the important point is this. When we talk about Christian charity, examples are spelled out by the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. His ideas of what charity means, you can call them Christian, but they're very universal. And you don't have to be a Christian to practice them at all. And this is a very important point because it transcends religiosity, as it were. Does this country do that? In many ways it does, but there's a long ways to go. The more we cling to the material side of our existence as being the most important pursuit, the more charity, Christian charity, may take a bit of a back seat. But it's important to keep in mind Americans as a whole can be extremely generous and very charitable in many ways. Again, this is a general overview. Have we truly accepted equality because we know that prejudices of class and birth are not rooted because they are incompatible with true love for one's neighbor? I think one of the key words in this phrase is rooted. Is prejudice rooted? Have we uprooted prejudice? No. Have we started pulling it out? Oh, yes. I mean, let's not forget, this country had 300 years of slavery. The Civil War was fought mainly in the time of Abraham Lincoln, 1861 to 1865. The Civil War was about keeping the country together. There were severe divisions, part of which had to do with slavery, but the war didn't start necessarily because of slavery, although there was a strong abolitionist movement, anti-slavery versus pro-slavery. But the northern part of this country and the southern part of this country were very divided over this subject and much more. There were very strong cultural differences. And prejudice in general is still with us, certainly. But I would like to say that, again, this is a process, and it's going to take a long time. Right now we live in a time where there's some very open fears about extremism and things like that. But these are prejudices that have been with us all along. They're just coming up to the surface again, regardless of how one feels about that and is afraid or not afraid of it. But it's not something we should accept, by the way. But prejudices of class and birth. Well, it is possible for people to move from one class to another in this country. So there's not these rigid barriers, economic. And again, in terms of one's personal progress, this country would argue that it doesn't matter where you come from necessarily. And there have been many, many examples of people who came from unprivileged backgrounds that were able to find success and prosperity of both material but also spiritual progress as well. So we're, again, this question, like the others, I would like to say we're in a state of transition. In many ways, it's like this. Spiritism talks about the regeneration of the planet. Well, when you think of the regeneration phase, it could last decades and even centuries. And we're still have work to do, to put it mildly. But look at the things that have occurred versus the things that haven't. And I also should mention, when it comes to prejudice and history that we should not be very proud of, is the treatment in this country of Native Americans. There was a very deliberate and conscious effort to get rid of them or displace them. Now, many died because of disease, but nevertheless, there were kind of self-serving philosophical attitudes in the 19th century, like manifest destiny. It was our manifest destiny to expand and conquer the rest of the American continent for primarily European-based immigrants and settlers and so forth. That itself is a big subject. But so the jury is still out, but I would say that there has been a lot of progress made in this area, but it's a tough one as well. I'm going to start to wrap up, to go back to Jefferson and Hamilton for a moment. And the reason is because Thomas Jefferson's home is called Monticello. It's in Virginia. You can go visit it. And the author, Jacob Nielman, who wrote The American Soul, the book I was quoting from before, says some very interesting things. He goes to visit Monticello. And when he walks into the entrance of Monticello, he sees a statue of Jefferson, a bust, from the chest up. Okay. But then he looks over, and opposite Jefferson's bust, the statue of Jefferson, is a statue of Alexander Hamilton. And Nielman notices this and thought, that's weird. Well, you know what? Probably the curators of this now museum probably put these two statues up there to make some kind of point. But he was surprised to find out that the Jefferson had a statue of himself in his own home, and Jefferson included a statue of Alexander Hamilton opposite of him. And in Jefferson's lifetime, there was a guest at his home who was a little puzzled by this. And he asked Jefferson, why? This guy was your rival. You two really clashed a great deal. Jefferson's answer was, opposed in death as in life. This is a very interesting comment. Jefferson, it's probably safe to say, got very frustrated by Alexander Hamilton. But Jefferson strongly believed that even if I don't like this man's opinions and I really disagree with him, I respect his right to have them, and it's important that he has them. Our founding fathers created a structure of government that was not based on the assumption that we were all going to agree and be harmonious, because they knew that was not going to happen. And it's not necessary to happen. We are, of course, going to disagree, sometimes very passionately. We see signs of that today. But the heart of democracy is that we can respect and care about one another, even if we really disagree and perhaps even infuriate each other. A more recent example, the Supreme Court Justice Ruth Ginsburg, who passed away recently, pretty liberal, and Anton Scalia, Supreme Court Justice, also passed away, who was arch conservative. They clashed a lot But you know what? They liked each other and they were friends. So in spite of their huge political differences, they could still, as it were, be at a barbecue together. And this is really, in many ways, the heart of democracy. Because if we live in an atmosphere in which I don't like what other people believe, so I want to annihilate them, if people feel that way, well, that's losing sight of what democracy is all about. Democracy takes a lot of work. You have to be actively involved in democracy. It's not on autopilot. And so when we talk about the law of progress in America, it is important to keep in mind that democracy always has to be worked at, just like, say, a relationship, a close relationship that we're in, a marriage. It's always requiring our attention. We always have to pay attention to what we're doing. And so, again, this country is still working towards the future. And we need to find that balance between the material and the spiritual. And finding that balance, again, means that the material is not bad, but we have to understand the purpose of the material life, the physical life. Certainly, Spiritism emphasizes that we're here in the physical world, we're in our bodies, we're interacting with all the material challenges that we have in front of us to learn, to grow, to overcome these challenges. Yes, they're trials in many ways, but they're also absolutely necessary. Spiritual progress is in many ways about detaching from materiality, but that doesn't mean abandoning it or treating it as if it's something horrible and bad and something we should be ashamed of. Rather, we just need to remember that as we move through our lives, can we use these things as tools and don't let them define us? And with that, I would like to thank all of you very much.
Thank you so much, Peter. We do have a good number of questions if you're open to for that.
All right, sure.
Daniel's going to be putting them on the screen.
Okay.
And okay, we're going to go with my question first. Okay. How can we play a more positive role to help humanity to progress, especially when humanity is so backwards, or can seem that way, rather?
Okay. In her book, Family Constellation, by the Spirit Joanna de Angelis, psychograph by Givaldo Franco, she emphasizes that healthy families make a healthy society. So a very important thing all of us can do is work on the environment that we have in our own families. The idea is the more we work on creating a healthy environment within our families, we're teaching one another within our families to learn how to interact with people outside of our families in more positive ways. So that's a big step. It's kind of like think globally, act locally, to quote Nate. So we don't have to go out and save the world, okay? Some people may have that as a mission, and that, you know, God bless them for it. But if we are such that we're really, it's just plenty for us to be focused on our families, then are we seeing our families as a mission in which the people in our family may be individuals that we've had prior relationships with, again, a Spiritist point of view about families. And if that's the case, why are we together? What do we need to work out with one another? Who are these people? Who is this person that is my son and daughter? Who are these parents of mine and the other relatives that I have? What kind of journey do I have with them? Can we find ways to work things out when we need to? So all of that is certainly helpful. If one's involved in Spiritist centers, well, certainly having things like good study groups, encouraging thoughtful discourse can be a good start. Is that a guarantee? Of course not. But at the same time, really, I think the answer is we need to work on transforming ourselves. Every one of us has a responsibility in that. And the more we can work on ourselves and begin to transform bit by bit, then the more we can, be that beacon of light as an example to others.
Perfect. Thanks, Peter, for that. And then we'll go on to our next question.
Okay.
And this is from Sarah. Do you think Americans will ever be a truly advanced civilization and a true civilization? Wow, I can't talk today. Do you think Americans will ever be a true advanced civilization in the near future? Or how long do you think it would take for America to grow in a fully advanced civilization?
Gosh, that's a good question. I don't know that I would dare to suggest a timeline. I think one thing that can happen, though, is when we look at the social problems that get reported in the media and things like that, social problems that are very real. One question one can ask is, how do people really feel deep down underneath? And maybe more people are more embracing of certain positive signs of progress than we might think. And as I was stressing before, there have been advances made in a very short period of time. And I talked about the rights of women and people of color as just one example. In just my lifetime, we have seen significant changes. So I think we still have a ways to go. Part of it is a reorientation about our priorities. I had a conversation recently in which a person pointed out that I guess there was a lot of studies done of people who were in the process of dying. And almost nobody said, gee, I wish I had been more materially successful. What they regretted more was, I wish I'd had a better relationship with my family. I wish I had, in some ways, personal relationships mattered a lot more than the material success. So maybe if people more and more really feel that's important, then you might see some significant changes in a time that's shorter than we think. But I would always be a little hesitant to make a prediction about that. Progress can sometimes be very slow, and sometimes there can be these little growth spurts that occur. So.
Makes sense. We'll go on to our next question. From Leo. What would you say is the responsibility of an immigrant in this nation to contribute to its moral progress?
I would say it's the same as, say, someone who's a natural, who was born here as well. We need to understand, I think, core values. I mentioned charity before. It's mentioned as Christian charity, but again, these values are universal. Are we patient with one another? Do we have compassion for one another? Do we bear all things, endure all things? Do we not think evil of people or think bad thoughts automatically? Do we learn to have a deeper understanding of one another? Are we more accepting of one another in spite of our differences in our background, maybe different beliefs about the nature of our existence? Maybe we agree, maybe we don't agree. Are we tolerant of different cultural and religious backgrounds? All of that, certainly immigrants play a role in that. The challenge that immigrants have, people who are immigrants are more articulate about this than I am. But part of it is certainly, okay, I have my cultural background, and now I'm here in this country. Do I understand this country? Do I understand what really matters here? Do I understand what needs to happen? How can I be the best person I can possibly be? Well, those are difficult things sometimes to figure out. But nevertheless, there are universal values that we can try to pursue regardless of our circumstances.
Well said. Oh, I think, am I muted? No. Okay. Well said. Thanks, Peter. Next question. This comes from Yasko. Hi, Peter. Brilliant talk on good material. If I'm not mistaken, I didn't see clearly the pursue or emphasis on spiritual enlightenment in the definition of what civilization is, and also in the argument of Jefferson versus Hamilton. What is the impact of this in current and future of the United States as the material progress will reach the top and decline?
Okay. Well, thank you, Yasko, for the question. I apologize if I didn't make certain things as clearly as I was hoping to. The emphasis on spiritual enlightenment, when we talk about civilization, allowing for the growth of the arts and sciences, the recording of information, for instance. One could ask, well, what kind of information are we recording? The fact that we keep information recorded at all is a way of helping us to remember. So one way to understand that would be the proliferation of books, the proliferation of ideas. Spiritists study the Spiritist Codification, right? That's a written document. So it's a document that's widely shared, as many other documents that are intended to help people with their personal progress in various ways. So we don't just do everything verbally. We can go back and repeat, learn. The recording of information could also be understood in terms of the existence of schools, universities, and so forth, all of which are designed to encourage intellectual and spiritual development, I would say. When I say spiritual development, I mean learning how to solve various problems, learning how to understand who we are as individuals. You don't have to necessarily be a deeply religious person. And when I say that, I mean religiosity, dogmatic, and that sort of thing, in order to really pursue spiritual progress. As far as the conflict between Jefferson and Hamilton, the spiritual development really was, I think, the understanding that probably both men had, that it was important that we can disagree, that we can be open in our disagreement. I don't know exactly how Hamilton felt about Jefferson. I must admit, I didn't do all of that kind of historic research. But I think it's important to stress that Hamilton and Jefferson had to be able to respect one another in order to move forward in life. So when we talk about spiritual progress, it has to do with that. I hope I answered the question.
Additional question?
Mm-hmm.
Leo, maybe this is a follow-up question. He said, although we have made some progress as a nation, we still identify many areas of opportunity. How can one not get discouraged and continue to do its parts in society's moral progress?
By understanding what it means to have faith, I think having faith means that we believe that progress is possible, that we can make things better. But if we don't get as far as we would like, that doesn't mean that we have failed necessarily or anything like that. In fact, we shouldn't look at it as being a failure at all. And we have to learn patience with progress. If I have a strong need to go out and save the world, as it were, and my definition of success depends on me saving the world, well, I'm probably going to be disappointed. But can I do my part to maybe plant some kind of seeds for a few people that might make a difference? Whether it makes a difference or not is really not in my hands. So when we talk about what is in God's hands, really a lot of that means that we do what we can. As long as we're trying, that matters a lot, but we don't control the outcome. The outcome is really not for us to determine. But we do we have a role in the responsibility of trying to make sure that we try to make things better. Try to, if we see an opportunity, try to do our part, rather than be indifferent, apathetic, and closing ourselves off. When we retreat, that may be very comfortable, but we're also essentially saying to the world, I don't believe in what I have to offer anybody, so why bother? Well, certainly Spiritism would not encourage one to do that, and you don't have to be a Spiritist to understand that that attitude is counterproductive and against progress.
And Peter, we were recently at we took our children to the Baltimore Aquarium, and we were listening to someone speak there, and they were talking about preserving the earth and the oceans and whatnot. And one of the things that I thought it was really nice that this gentleman mentioned was that he suggested to everybody that was at the aquarium, whoever was listening, that you carry a plastic bag around with you, or some sort of bag with you. So when you're out and about, if you see trash on the ground, just pick it up. And how much if each one of us did that, how much we could, clean up our neighborhoods.
Yeah. Actually, that's a very important point. Suppose we are not used to taking the initiative. Well, if we see something we could do, maybe we should do it. I mean, that may be kind of obvious to put it that way, but it's a very important point.
Absolutely. And I think we have a question from Paula. Paula, would you like to go ahead and use the mic?
Thank you. This is Paula. I'm on.
I wasn't able to hear.
Oh, come up, Paula. Do you want to just come up here?
Yeah.
It's yellow.
Yeah, come. Just stand right here. This side. Come this side.
Hi.
Hi.
This is Paula, and thanks for everyone being so accommodating, and thank you for your talk. And it's very timely, and I hope we continue to discuss your points. My question is, in relationship to your comment about JFK's positive impact on people's fears about Catholicism and the Pope, how do you see Barack Obama's presidency having some positive impact on people's racial fears?
Right.
Just if you could comment more on that. Thanks.
Yes. The idea of having an African-American president not very long ago would have been unheard of. So in my childhood, I grew up in the 60s, during the time of John F. Kennedy, for instance. There's no way an African-American would have been elected president. And I think most African-Americans were surprised that Barack Obama was elected, but also felt very encouraged, to say the least. Does that mean everything is fine? No. It's opening a door. Will we have a woman president? Of course we will. I can't say when, but it may happen sooner than later. Let's put it that way. Prejudice dies hard, as they say. So some people, some of the reactions we've seen might be a bit of a reaction to that. Is it something to be terrified by? Well, if we are indifferent to it, we might need to be. But whenever there's a backlash, some of that, I think, is this country does have its negativity. And there's negativities and impulses in this country that have been with us for a long time. And some of them are getting flushed out into the open right now in a big way. Is that bad? Well, is it better to shine a light everywhere? It's like the idea that we may lie to ourselves, we may lie to one another, but we can't lie to God. And sometimes the divine laws have a way of encouraging certain openness to be pushed out. So I think Barack Obama's presidency certainly opened a door. And the more people see that, and again, new generations are coming along, and it's very likely some of them are going to have very different perspectives about openness. It's been observed, for instance, that the younger generation in many ways is much more tolerant of different racial, ethnic, cultural, gender differences and so forth than older generations have been. Doesn't mean, and so it makes sense that this country would go through, making some progress in an area of having a historic precedence, and then maybe there's a backlash, but then there's maybe an effort to move forward again. A lot of times progress is 2 steps forward, 1 step back. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So we may see in the short run things that can be very frightful. And again, we shouldn't dismiss them. But does it mean that everything is hopeless and we're on a one-way road to tyranny and fascism? Well, I don't think so, but I think, but it also is a wake-up call that we have to be actively involved with our democracy.
Well said, Peter. Thank you so much. Just want to double check. Last opportunity. Any questions? We're already at time.
Okay.
Anyone here? The physical space? No? All right. Okay. Oh, we do have one last more. Thanks, Peter. Do you have any spiritual information in the continuity of participations of the founding fathers as spirits in the afterlife after their discarnation?
Well, I don't, but it's been said that one of the contributors to the Spirits book was Benjamin Franklin. Something about Benjamin Franklin that I'll mention that I think is interesting is that during the forming of the United States Constitution, Benjamin Franklin had suggested to his fellow founding fathers that maybe we should be praying every day. And the idea was that when you pray, sometimes there are forces that can work in your favor. He was really encouraging spiritual alignment and getting in touch with a higher power. Well, he was voted down, and so they didn't do that. But I think it was interesting that he felt that way, because I thought it was a very Spiritist type point of view about things. I don't necessarily have, there may be information out there, so I have not personally looked for it. So I'm afraid I can't say much more than that. But while I'm thinking about it, I'll also mention something else in terms of the I think, spiritual progress of our founding fathers. When George Washington became president, he was our first president. He had a golden opportunity to just grab it and be basically the king of the now independent American colonies. But George Washington deliberately said, I'm only going to serve 2 terms and that's it. So he deliberately chose not to grab power. And that had a very profound precedent for the way this country would move forward. The idea that nobody who's at the top, as it were, is going to stay there indefinitely. Now, yes, Washington was getting kind of old at that point, and probably the thought of being president for the rest of his life was a little arduous. But nevertheless, it also reveals a great deal of humility, a great deal of compassion for and concern about what is really in the best interest of this new country. And I think that this type of gesture is a very important one when we think about what it means to have power. That it's more, if we have it, that we see it as a guardianship. It's not something that we try to hang on to indefinitely.
Wow. Well said, especially for our last few moments here, Peter. And that was a great reminder. I didn't even know that about Benjamin Franklin, and I'm from Philadelphia, and thought I knew knew a lot about him. I
Mhm.
really did not. That's a really nice fact. Yep. So now we're going to Peter. Thank you so much for attending and being here with us and sharing, this information with us. It is always a pleasure to have you with us. And I'm sure in the future we're going to have you here in person because, there's something about being in person that's, well, it's different, right? But we
Oh, yeah.
so
Yeah.
grateful that you made the time. I know that you were so super busy, but that you made the time for us here at the SSB. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. I'd like to, yeah.
So now we're going to, normally we do passes, but tonight, because of the large amount of people that we have here, we are just going to do a spiritual passes for this evening. So we'll end with a prayer and do our spiritual passes. So for those of you who are still watching on the web, you can please join us in these moments. We're going to be playing a light music here in just a second. And you can just get yourself into a comfortable position. Okay.